Hello, my name is Zaher Sahloul, and I'm really privileged and humbled to address the North American Refugee Health Conference about an important issue in our lifetime, and which is the Syrian crisis and how the Syrian crisis affected the world. Um, and this is, I'm Syrian American, I'm a physician in Chicago. I'm full-time practitioner. My specialty is pulmonary and critical care medicine. But in the last 10 years, I've lived the Syrian crisis minute by minute, day by day. I participated in multiple medical missions to Syria, to Turkey, to Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, and other countries. We built organization to provide healthcare to the displaced Syrians inside Syria. We trained Syrian physicians. We used telehealth to communicate with them and provide assistance and training. We donated technology and medications and medical supplies through cross-border relief through Turkey and Jordan. We also participated in many medical missions to provide healthcare to the Syrian refugees in the neighboring countries in Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, Iraq, and also in Europe, in the Greece at the peak of the refugee crisis. So I'm privileged to speak about an issue that is very dear to my heart, and I think it is very important to all of us who are concerned about the healthcare of the refugees, about fragile states, about providing healthcare and building community resilience in areas that are going through man-made disasters like Syria. And let me share my screen. My organization is MedGlobal. We provide healthcare to disaster regions and low resources countries through partnering with local organizations and building capacity within the local communities and providing technology, innovations, and advocacy. This is the title of the presentation, The Syrian Crisis That Changed the World. Which I believe that I hope that you can be convinced by the end of this presentation that what happened in Syria was not only contained in Syria, but also it affects the whole world, including the United States. And I'm not saying that just because I'm Syrian American, but because I believe of what the consequences of the Syrian crisis were in a scale that it affected the way that we look at the world, our sentiment toward refugees and immigrants, and also change the politics in many countries, including the United States. By the way, you can communicate with me through Twitter, and this is my Twitter handle, Sahloul. You can send me an email. You can communicate also through the website. So I'll start with this quote, which is, I think it is very true, which I'm quoting Princeton scholar Philip Hitti, who mentioned, that's quote from the 1950 or so, that Syria is the largest small country on the map, microscopic in size, but cosmic in influence, encompassing in its geography at the confluence of Europe, Asia, and Africa, the history of the civilized world in a miniature form. So Syria is small as a country on the map, but it is located in a place that is very important and strategic in terms of geography, and also because of its history, it's very important, and also because of its influence on an important region, which is the Middle East. A few years ago, Richard Stern, who is the head of World Vision, wrote this article, which is why Syria needs an earthquake. The theme of this article that Americans in general are not paying attention to the worst or greatest humanitarian crisis in decades because of three reasons. He called them the three M's. Each M stands for a letter. The first M stands for man-made. This is a man-made disaster. It's a war. And usually we pay attention more to natural disasters than man-made disasters. He said in 1 week after the earthquake in Haiti, his organization received more donations than 6 years of crises in Syria, because Syrian crisis is man-made. The second M stands for mind-boggling. It's very complex, and we tend to look at crises as very simplistic ways, you know, the villains and the victims. So if the situation is complex, we tune out. So that's the second M. And the third M is for Muslims, because most of the victims are Muslims. And post 9/11, we have a tendency, and this is proven by many polls, by Pew and others, that we have a negative view of Islam and Muslims in general. And because most of the victims in Syria are Muslims, then we have less attention by the American public to what's going on there. I wrote this article in Chicago Tribune a few years ago at the peak of the crisis, that shouldn't we pay more attention to Syria? And I think this still stands, that we, you know, the scale of the crisis is very important, because it's the worst humanitarian crisis since the Second World War. It's the worst refugee crisis since the Second World War. It is the intersection of the climate change, geopolitics, healthcare disparity, religion, and fragile states. There is many instances of use of prohibited chemical weapons, which did not happen frequently in any other crises. There's undermining of medical neutrality and international humanitarian law. There are crimes against humanity and war crimes, and even genocide in the mind of many Syrians. There is an impact on healthcare and stability in several important countries in the Middle East and even in Europe. There is a large number of Syrian refugees who were resettled in the West, including the United States. And we need to know more about who are these refugees, what are their health issues, what's their attitude, and so forth. And of course, there's a mental health crisis because of the scale of the violence in Syria. And also, lastly, it is affecting us. Because all of these reasons, we should care more about Syria. This is a map of the world's refugees population. And as you see, the Syrian refugees are the largest number of the world's refugees. There's about 25 million refugees nowadays. And these are the people who were displaced outside of their countries. 1 out of 4 of them were from Syria. And then the second would be Afghanistan. You have also 2.2 million from South Sudan, a large number from Myanmar, the Rohingya refugees. The difference between the Syrian refugees and the other refugees, you have many in Africa, for example, Central Asia, East Asia, that Syrian refugees are very close to Europe. And that we've witnessed the impact of that, of course, between 2014 2016, with the large number of Syrian refugees fleeing to Europe. This is not from Syria. This is a refugee camp in Bangladesh, in Cox's Bazar. We had a medical mission to provide healthcare to the Rohingya refugees. Most of the Rohingya refugees, about 1.2 million of them, who are the victims of genocide, are staying in camps like this. This is one of the largest camps that has 750,000 Rohingya refugees. They're mostly in Bangladesh. They're not able to move to other countries, and they are mostly camped. And this is very different than the Syrian refugees, as we will see. This is a graph that shows the impact of the Syrian crisis that started in 2011 on the number of the Syrian refugees. And as you see, we had a significant increase year after year of the number of Syrian refugees until now. Now they represent the largest number of refugees in the world. Before the crisis, Syria, of course, is a very historic country. It's the cradle of civilization. It's quite diverse country, 31 ethnic and religious groups. Majority in terms of religions are Sunni Muslims, but also we have significant minorities in terms of religious affiliations, including the Alawite, the Christians with different denominations within the Christian faith. Of course, the first church in Antioch near Syria, and there's a significant historic Christian sites in Syria. Of course, we have also significant Druze community in Suwaida in southwest of Syria, and also mainstream Shia community. There are many also ethnic groups in Syria. The majority are Arabs, of course, who speak the Arabic language, but also we have significant Kurdish groups, Turkmen, and Assyrians. Damascus is the capitals, but Aleppo, Homs, Hama, Daraa, Latakia are also major cities. There are 13 governorates in Syria. There are 6 World Heritage Center sites and 12 tentative sites. These are some of the 6 UNESCO designated World Heritage Sites: the old city of Damascus, the old city in Aleppo. This is the longest bazaar in the world. This is Palmyra in Homs Governorate, and this is Qalat al-Husn in Arabic, Crac des Chevaliers, which is one of the castles that were built by the Crusaders near my city, Homs. It's middle-income country with good health care benchmarks before the crisis. It has diversified economy. It's not rich in gas and oil. It has very resourceful and large Syrian diaspora. Some of the estimate that there are about 20 million Syrians who live outside of Syria before the crisis in the United States, in Europe, in the Gulf states, in Latin America. There's large Syrian community in Brazil, Argentina, Colombia, and other places. There are holy and symbolic Muslim and Christian sites. It has rich and turbulent history like any other country in the Middle East and the Old World. It was under the control of France or occupation, as we call it in Syria, until 1946, and before that it was occupied by the Ottoman Empire. Assad family has ruled Syria since 1970. Assad, Hafiz al-Assad, the father of the current president, ruled since 1970. One party ruled Syria, which is Al-Ba'ath Party, since 1963. It had a long drought before 2011 for about 10 years, which led to moving of large number of Syrians from the rural areas to the urban areas. About 2 million immigrated from rural to urban areas before 2011. And that was attributed to climate change. There's a high percentage of youth. More than 65% of Syrians are below age of 25. There's actually well-educated middle class in Syria. As many other countries that are in middle income, there was a drift from communicable to non-communicable diseases over the past 4 decades. But it has one of the highest smoking rate in the region, low spending on healthcare by the government. But in spite of the low spending, we had good healthcare benchmarks. The age expectancy is about 76 years in 2011. Shortage of mental health professionals even before the crisis. Coronary artery disease accounted for more than half of the mortality in Syria before 2011. But as I mentioned, we had good basic healthcare benchmarks, including vaccination rate, morbidity and mortality, and neonatal and women healthcare in general. In 2011, March 15, we had demonstrations in Syria as part of the Arab Spring. People who are actually in the beginning quite diverse and peaceful went to the streets demanding for freedoms and democracy. They wanted to get rid of the regime that ruled Syria for more than 40 years, and they believed that the regime is corrupt and had very poor governance policy that led to high rate of joblessness, and especially among the youth, and they wanted more freedoms. And they've witnessed what happened in Tunisia and Egypt and Libya, and they wanted the same thing in Syria. And it's a little bit more complex than that, of course. So when you have demonstrations in the street, it reflects complex factors, including poor governance, as I mentioned, lack of freedoms. The Assad family reigned for more than 40 years, corruption, joblessness, young population. There were some sectarianism in Syria that was fed by many of the social media outlets and also the media outlets that promoted sectarianism between the Sunnis and the Shia. The Iraqi war had led to also worsening of this sectarianism. There's quick urbanization and controlled population growth. there is this ideology of jihadism and Islamism, which also was there, and the social media and other medias have promoted this extremist ideology. Historic event in Syria happened in 1981 when Hafiz al-Assad, the father of the current president, committed a massacre against the civilian population of the city of Hama, which led to the slaughtering of 20 to 40,000 people in over a couple of weeks. And this is still very fresh in the memory of many Syrians. So they associated the regime with extreme brutality. Of course, global warming and drought, the Iraqi war that has led to the recruitment of jihadists by the Assad regime, sending them to Iraq to fight our troops. And then they came back to Syria and were put in the prisons. The Arab Spring, as I mentioned, the democratization in Europe, social media, I would say that the demonstrations would not have happened in Syria without social media. Many of the demonstrations were promoted through Facebook, through Twitter, through YouTube, and that led to the young people especially going into the street. President Obama's speeches gave hope to the young people in the region that the United States will not support dictators and authoritarian regime, and they will support the aspirations of the people for democracy and reforms. Of course, you have also the complex area and geopolitics where you have several countries that wanted to dominate the region and exert its influence on Syria and the region through Syria, including Iran, Turkey, Russia, the United States, of course, Israel, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and Hezbollah, and especially in Lebanon, which was allied with the Assad regime. And of course, you have the Kurds in Syria who were, the human rights were violated by the Assad regime, and they wanted to have more autonomous rule in Syria. All of these factors have affected what's happening in Syria and led to the current situation, and especially the early demonstrations in Syria. What was the response of the Assad regime? The Arab Spring, as we know, started in 2011. So we had dictators who ruled Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, and Yemen for a long time. They were forced out by February 2012. The first demonstrations in Syria happened in the city of Daraa in the south, close to Jordan, and on March 15, 2011, as a reaction to the Assad regime torturing children in that city who wrote on the wall of their school that your turn is coming, Dr. Assad, and that's his title. And in response to this writing on the wall, literally, these children were taken, detained, and tortured, and then sent to their family. Their family were humiliated. That led to the early demonstrations. The Assad regime had time to plan for the response for the demonstrations, learning from what happened in Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, and Yemen. So the first thing that they did, that they deployed snipers to shoot at peaceful demonstrators. They assassinated the peaceful leaders of the demonstrations and detained them and tortured them. They deployed the army in the street, and the army started to shoot at demonstrations, putting cities and neighborhoods under siege. They detained and tortured injured demonstrators and also the doctors who treated them. They militarized hospitals, so they put snipers on the roof of hospitals. They put security agents inside the hospitals who came and snatched injured demonstrators from the operating room, from the ICU, and detained them and killed them. They also detained physicians. Some of the hospitals which were public hospitals were transformed into torture chambers to injured demonstrations, according to Human Rights Watch and other human rights organizations. They also formed an armed, brutal paramilitary groups. They called them Al-Shabiha, and they publicized their videos of torture to scare the population. And they publicized also massacres that happened in the cities of Daraa, Al-Hula, Bayada, Daraya, Harasta, and Homs. You had these massacres that are very gruesome that were publicized by the social media. They tortured children. One of the famous children that was tortured, his name is Hamza Al-Khatib. He participated in early demonstrations in Daraa and he was detained, tortured, then his dead body that is mutilated was sent to his family in 2011. There were incidents of mass rape, and that led to fear by the population, and gradually the local population started to arm themselves to defend their families, to defend the demonstrations, and defend their neighborhoods. There was no political concessions, and there were also sophisticated propaganda by the regime. They employed what's called the Syrian electronic army that was spreading fake news and counteracting the demonstrations demands, and had certain messaging towards the West, directed especially at the West. And they had also employed certain Western journalists who basically promoted the regime's propaganda, talking to the extreme left and the extreme right in the West. They fed into sectarianism. They also, and that's the most important thing, that they employed or deployed indiscriminate violence against civilians in populated areas under the opposition control. And they provoked militarization of demonstrations and defection of army units and officers because of all of these policies. One of the things that they deployed is called barrel bombs. So these are barrels, literally big barrels, that are stuffed with TNT and shrapnels. Helicopters came, military helicopters, and dropped them on populated areas. And these are weapons of mass destruction. They're cheap and dumb. They destroy whole blocks and cause a lot of death and mutilation. And this is the impact of one of the barrel bombs in the city of Aleppo. It's interesting to see or hear some of the quotes of Bashar al-Assad, the president, who in one of the speeches in June 3rd, 2011 said, "When a surgeon in an operating room cuts and clean and amputate and the wound bleeds, do we say to him, 'Your hands are stained with blood,' or do we thank him for saving the patient?" Of course, Assad is himself a physician who got trained in the United Kingdom in 2 years as an eye doctor before he was taken back to Syria to become the president when his father died in year 2000. Industrial torture was deployed. Caesar was one of the military officers who defected, and he took with him files of 28,000 photos of people who were tortured to death. And these are exhibited in the United States Holocaust Museum. You can see these pictures of prisoners, people who were detained after the demonstrations, and they were tortured to death in 2014. People now estimate there are about 125,000 people inside the prisons. They labeled anyone who supports the opposition as a criminal or terrorist, basically using the same war on terror sentiments and premises to label everyone who provide aid to the opposition as a terrorist or criminal. And they labeled all positions as Islamist or Takfiris. They also did something that is very interesting in the beginning of the crisis, that they released jihadis who are the same ones who came back from Iraq and were put in the prisons, and they allowed them to organize and form armed groups which became ISIS and al-Nusra. They attacked healthcare workers and centers, and this is something that we have not seen in any other crises, the systematic attacks on healthcare systems in Syria, in areas that are under the control of the opposition. There were thousands of incidents that were documented of violations of international humanitarian law. They used siege as a tactic. They exploited the UN aid that was provided to Syria to channel it to areas that are perceived as loyalist, and denying areas that are perceived as restive or against the regime. And this is also documented by United Nations report. They used chemical weapons multiple times, as I will detail, and used barrel bombs, as I have mentioned. And they encouraged displacement of the population to neighboring countries, Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey, to create some demographic changes in areas. They prevented safe return of the refugees. They benefited from the war economy. Even they enacted the regime enacted laws to enforce demographic changes. One of them is law number 10, which basically makes the government able to deny people who ask for their houses, if they come back as refugees, deny them the ownership of their houses. They invited Hezbollah militias, Iran and Russia, and their paramilitary groups to participate in the war against its civilian. As we see, this is part of the siege in Mukhayyam al-Yarmouk camp, which is Palestinian camp in Damascus. The area was put under siege by the Syrian army, and this is when the United Nations tried to provide one of the humanitarian aid. People came out from these buildings, wanted to have bread and food and so forth. It's a very famous picture in Syria. And this is one of the consequences of this policy, which is thousands of people fled Syria to neighboring countries. One of the speeches of Bashar al-Assad in August 20th, 2017, he said, "It's true that we lost the best of our young men as well as our infrastructure, but in return, we earned a healthier and more homogeneous society." Every time I prepare for a lecture about Syria, I have to change the figures. Valerie Amos, which is the past UN chief for humanitarian affairs, was quoted as, "Every time we use a new figure in relation to Syria, to the Syrian crisis, we say it is unprecedented." So these are some of the numbers. 500,000 to 1 million people were killed in Syria. At least 2 million were injured. 13.1 million in need for humanitarian assistance, according to the UN. 5.5 million registered refugees as of August 2020, used to be 6.5. So the numbers are decreasing because of the resettlement. 6.6 million IDPs inside Syria, including 2.5 million children. Only in this year, I mean, people may think that this is happening in the past. This year, 2020, we had an additional 1.1 million newly displaced people in Syria, in the province of Idlib, northwest of Syria, following a campaign of airstrikes by the Syrian regime and the Russian. Most of the IDPs in Syria were displaced up to 8 or 9 times before they ended up in some of the refugees camps, or displaced camps, or other areas. There are 6.2 million Syrians in hard-to-reach areas in the northwest and northeast of Syria. 4 out of 5 Syrians have no jobs, 80% below the poverty line. We have a lost generation of Syrian children. We have disintegration of public health system, regional refugee crisis created by the displacement. A global refugee crisis was created of the displacement of Syrians. An average life expectancy dropped to 69 years from 76 years, which is similar to the life expectancy in Syria 29 years before the crisis. This is one of the drawing of a second grade student in the city of Aleppo who had post-traumatic stress disorder. We use art therapy to treat these children. And he drew this picture of helicopters that are dropping barrel bombs, houses on fire, and children who are dead and mutilated, and children who are alive. And what's very interesting in this picture, that the children who are dead are smiling, and the ones who are living are crying. When Syrians who fled to Europe, to Germany, were asked which are the most important internal events that have led to the current situation in Syria, the majority of them, they said the Assad military response to the demonstrations. Some say it's related to ISIS and other jihadist group, military action by the rebels or the demonstration, but the supermajority blame Assad military response to the demonstration. And this is a map of Syria, now Syria is divided into 3 major areas. You have most of the Syria that is controlled by the government, this area. The northwest is under the control of the rebels or the opposition. The northeast is under the control of Kurdish rebel groups or SDF, and there are areas in the north that are under the control of Turkey here and here. So Syria is still a divided country in terms of who controls what, which makes humanitarian assistance and medical aid is more complex. If you are providing aid in this area, you won't be able to provide aid in government-controlled areas or in Kurdish-controlled areas, and vice versa. This is an review article about the impact of the war in Syria on healthcare, focusing on pulmonary and critical care and sleep medicine. It's a good review article about the impact of war in general on healthcare and what has been done to build resilience with within the Syrian context.